actually meet Drew in person until a few minutes ago. I've seen his presentations virtually before and have always been impressed. Drew, as I told some of you, moved heaven and earth to get here, and so we are so appreciative of his able to get here through travel challenges and family emergency, and he has to head back out at 3 a.m. tomorrow morning to catch a 5-something flight out of Dulles. So thank you so much, Drew. I'll start by saying that. Dr. Drew Lanham is a certified wildlife biologist who earned his BA, MS, and PhD all at Clemson University. Go Tigers. He is an academic, author, poet from Edgefield and Aiken, South Carolina. He's an alumni distinguished professor, provost professor, and master teacher of wildlife ecology at Clemson, where his most recent scholarly efforts addressed the confluence of race, place, and nature. A conservation and cultural ornithologist, he has mentored nearly 50 graduate students, so listen up, graduate students in the hall, published extensively in scientific literature and taught courses in conservation biology, forest ecology, wildlife policy, ornithology, environmental literature, and nature writing. Drew's creative work and opinion appears abundantly online and in print broadly, nearly a dozen or more venues and publications. His online presence on YouTube as well as social media is extensive. Drew has been featured in Garden and Gun magazine and Clemson World. He teaches writing workshops and creative nonfiction. Dr. Lanham is a past board member of the National Audubon Society, Audubon South Carolina Wildlife Federation, Aldo Leopold Foundation, BirdNote, and the American Birding Association. Drew considers himself an eco-social advocate activist. At heart, a man in love with nature. Drew is a lifelong bird watcher with many speaking engagements at birding festivals. We were just talking about a few of them and his experiences with that, and of course, leading tours as well. He is an avid hunter, gatherer, conservationist, and works to bridge the two passions among the nature-loving public. And again, we had a nice conversation ahead of that because he noticed I brought my camo vest. Tonight's presentation is entitled Range Mapping and the Art of Identifying with Birds, Heart and Mind Convergence for Bird Conservation. Please welcome Dr. J. Drew Lanham.
Wow. I didn't know all these people were here. Thank you, Paul, for that warm welcome, and thank you all for that kind applause. It's always it's a little humbling, right, to be in this space. I like to say that this place makes April 15 feel a little better for me because these are tax dollars well spent at the National Conservation Training Center. So any time that I have the opportunity to be here, I know that I'm going to be among kindred spirits, that we're going to be in a flock, a mixed flock, but headed towards the same destination that ultimately is conservation, which is really making things better for those who we will never know. It's the old adage of planting that tree under whose shade you will never sit. And that's our work. That's our work. And so I was telling EJ and Paul and Ken, you know, this and Pete, that this really feels very different to me. And having been in this career for as long as I have, I was still a graduate student when I attended the first meeting of Partners in Flight back in Estes Park. It was, and that was way back in the 90s. if you can believe that. And that felt big, right? It felt big. And for a young ornithologist, it felt also untouchable in some ways. Yeah, we had a patch. And we had these things going, and Partners in Flight turned out to do a lot of great things. But we're in a different time now. And I think we're in a time where we need to feel the active in our activism. And make no mistake about it, I hope you aren't afraid of that word, activism, because that's what conservation better be. It doesn't mean being in the same place that you were. So the birds demand our activism. They demand us moving in a certain way in this very different time than presented itself just 3+ decades ago. So here we are. So what I want to share tonight, I was sort of warning Paul that I have a tendency to decide, oh, I don't want to do that presentation. Which sometimes I look at this and I'm like, because one of the first things, and I don't think you can see it here because it's not in that mode. One of the first things I learned long ago is when someone threw a PowerPoint up, my eyes would always go, before they had it into slide mode, my eyes would drift down to the lower left-hand corner to see how many slides they were going to be presenting. You do that, right? And then you're like, oh man, this is going to take a while. But I'm going to go at this in a little bit of a different way. I want to share something with you first that I've written. So I want us to think about this as a little bit, to take a pause tonight. I mean, I know you've been doing a lot of heavy lifting. You've been doing a lot of heavy lifting. And so from that heavy lifting, to take a little bit of a pause, and I am going to ask you to sort of put yourselves in some different skin / plumage in a few moments. But I'll share this first, sort of a purpose, I guess I'd call it, as we pause. Convergent urgency, the world in a hurry, the intersecting paths of wild things, braided rivers twisting in and out of one another, surging towards the sea. Salmon, humpbacked, hook-jawed, and snaggle-toothed, rushing in reverse of the waters wanting, pull to natal pebbles and slacking pools to loose egg and milt and fatal spurts of a future they will never see. The buck deer, knowing that the safer path runs parallel to the does. Nose to ground he chases, but she will make the final choice. Homo sapiens sapiens, us, never wanting to wait, rushing time away, hitting send, soliciting likes, and hoarding virtual friends. Driving at hyperspeed to and fro, swiping right or left for love. This urgency is essential for wild things, big and small, airborne, sea-tossed, or tunneled underground. The featherweight warbler at midnight, flying across a full moon guided by stars and instinct, passing over abysmal gulf and land expanses that may or may not be to land in some random tree. What tells this one bird where to come down? The 1,000-pound bison, wandering because it feels a compulsion, that same compulsion to graze that we can never know. There is something that brings life and force together in these beings. Much of it we can see, some we can explain by science, but volumes are unknown to us. The mysteries between known and unknown feed our fascinations. They are job security. I am a witness to as much as my life will allow. Here in my southern Piedmont home, or when allowed far away, wildness to me is inside as well as out there. my unwillingness to relent to the control of convention, to be always on the edges of my feelings, to break the boundaries of expectation. As far as I see it, while we are here talking about identifying with birds, I will talk about identifying myself. You see, my life lies at the intersection of three axes, three main axes. They are identity, place, and nature. More specifically, I can speak to my Blackness. I can speak to my Southern ruralness. I can speak to my love affair with wild birds and wild places. My job is to have people see those three things which aren't unique to me, but perhaps undercounted as valuable and viable. This is a complex and messy but necessary task to bring the three into a light that doesn't get swallowed up by convenient, cleaner narratives, or not get whitewashed out or colored over. And so I do my job by writing as forcefully as I can, but also as artfully and beautifully as I can. I would call that activism. Loosely defined, it's to move an agenda forward in some way that creates a larger change behind the action than existed before it. Again, to create larger change behind than existed before. That is activism. Even if that change is a different thought process heaved upon some previously flat plane of some old paradigm, I want people to be changed after they read what I write. I want them to be more aware, more thoughtful, more passionate. Perhaps they will be angry or sad or happy or whatever. We have to strike those irons while they are hot. So how do I bring my urgency to fore? How do I braid my three axes, these rivers of Blackness, Southernness, and wildness into one? I know that my time is limited and words with my existence likely to fade. And so while here in this earthly realm, I see birds as inspiration to be somehow persistently urgent. And so I watch birds, I study birds, I absorb birds with the yearning many days of wanting to be a bird. But since I cannot be that being and knowing full well Icarus's ego fallen fate, I write about birds. I write for birds, but I also write to birds. I write in poem and prose, I wordcraft in short form social media and long essay. I two-finger tap in minuscule mobile phone font and still sometimes scribble in longhand, this illegible chicken-scratched script that lies scattered in notepads and pieces of journals as draft stories and ragged verse. I gather all of this together, my data set, and weave and wrap until there is some story in which I can nest. I spend much of my time in my pickup truck parked on the shoulder of the road away from any formal room or space I've tried to dedicate to my writing craft. There's no desk other than my dashboard and steering wheel. My phone becomes typewriter and word processor. My binoculars and camera lie in the passenger seat to spy, inspire, to confirm. The notes start with a word some bird brings to mind, or maybe it's the way the pasture grass waves that day, or how the clouds cast herds of giant shadows on newly plowed ground. Maybe what comes into those observations of birds and wild things and wild places is how another unarmed Black person died because someone was afraid, or how dozens got gunned down in the next massacre, and a shrike's larder of some hapless dead things reminds me of being stuck in an inescapable thicket of violence and hate. And so I sit and watch and think about the beings I know intimately by song and plumage and habit. I write often with no intent of anyone else ever seeing, but as an exercise in solo worship and mind space sacrifice. A murmuration at that point becomes meditation. A call from a plover is alms. There is this melding of realities that causes me to lose track of responsibility and time. So I'm kind of crazy about birds, right? And I say, thank you. Now that's one of those things that I hadn't intended on sharing. It's like sort of got up here. But the point is this urgency, right? This urgency that wild things feel, but then for us, the lives that we live, bitter and sweet, the news that seems increasingly bitter. And then we're distracted by a bird hitting a window, no less bitter. So I thought tonight I'd spend a little bit of time telling you what I was going to tell you, but then going on from there and speaking a little bit about this art, because part of what I felt initially in some of these meetings online with Road to Recovery was a different feeling, and it was actually a feeling. It wasn't just a thinking about. Can you imagine, and this is going to sound scary coming from a scientist, and I assure you I am a scientist, but can you imagine this work with no feeling in it? You know, I advise people, I out-counsel students who don't understand that stake that they have to have in this game. Really, I ask them to go to finance. Because they're, you know, I don't know, maybe I imagine people feel markets, right? So I'm going to tell you a little bit of what I was going to tell you in the original presentation. This is a little bit of a stock presentation. I started doing this years ago because I had written about range maps. I had always sort of been an amateur cartographer. I love maps. And one of the first things that I learned with birds is whether it was in the Compton's encyclopedia or in my first Golden Field Guide, to go from that bird and identifying that bird and seeing field marks and wanting to see the map. Now, for me, that was one of the things that was so exciting about that Golden Guide, right? $4.95 was what it cost, by the way. And it took a lot of grass clippings to figure that out. So, oops, let's see here. All right. So first, you can ignore all this stuff. This is off the Cornell site, pretty much. So I want you to think about three birds right now. I want you to think about three birds. I want you to think about an almost ubiquitous habitat generalist, right? A very brightly colored bird, a bird that's pretty easy to see and recognize by folks. So, and you think about the range of this bird, you think about what yellow warblers can do, right? I mean, I've seen them in Denali, I've seen them down on the Osa, and they range south of that. But we're no less happy to see yellow warblers as the vanguard comes back here in just a few weeks as things turn back around. But I want you to think about this bird, what it requires. How are yellow warblers doing? Downward trends? What are they? They're sort of like, yeah, they're not falling off, right? I mean, those estimates are still counting them in the tens of thousands, right? All right, so yellow warbler, there's your first. Your second is a bird that I spent a lot of time with. I I call this the thicket warbler. And you see what I did there? It, it does, It does have designs on what it does. So, but this is the bird I spent a lot of time, the Alta race, as it were, that bird that spends so much of its time in the Southern Appalachians, and you learn to distinguish that Swainson song from the Louisiana water thrush, because the Louisiana water thrush has that little twist at the end, right? Not and Swainson's really are pretty emphatic. And it seems to me, I mean, at least one of the theories is while we were working with it, and we finally kind of figured out how to net the birds, is that the males are almost defending little watersheds, right? But their nests are down on that first or second order stream, and they have the largest nest of any warbler, but they build it fast. Now, my theory is that I think they're building on flotsam sometimes. And it seemed like they were building all their nest and regenerating hemlock, but guess what? Adelgid has seen that shift happen already just in a few years. So we started finding nests in dog hobble, and maybe we had keyed into a search image that biased us, but this is a bird. Look at its range compared to yellow warbler, really range restricted. And it's not a bird that, I mean, if I don't hear Swainson's, I don't see Swainson's. Some of you are, maybe they just walk up to you during migration. But it's a bird that, man, there are certain people, not everybody, but certain people, certain well-heeled people who had not seen Swainson's that I should have charged a king's ransom to take them to see those birds. But again, range limited. Brown bird, hard to see, hard to notice unless it speaks up. Maybe a little bit of a specialist, but maybe turning out to be a little more plastic, at least in terms of what we've seen when forced to do so. And our third bird. Okay, so I have seen people nearly kill one another on the boardwalk at the biggest week when the word went out that there was a Kirtland's. Really, I've seen people fall and get trampled. And one of the things that we would do, how many people here have been to the biggest week in American birding? Okay, you go. I want to talk a little bit about that later, but Ken and Kimberly Kaufman in the Black Swamp Bird Observatory, they do an amazing, amazing job there, trying to push conservation to hundreds of thousands of people that come through that place. But this is a bird that everybody will drop everything to rush and see. It's a bird that is, well, look, where's the range? You see how narrow that is. I saw my first Kirtland's warblers up in Adams County, actually, Wisconsin, in pine plantations and red pine plantations. Usually you go to Adams, some of you know why you go to Adams County, Wisconsin, and it's not birds, it's deer, big deer, right? But I was there for birds. And watching these birds in a place where people would not figure they were supposed to be, but still, the other ends of this bird's range is in Eleuthera, Bahamas, which Disney likes a lot. So you have habitat on that end that's being threatened by tourism and development. And on this end up here in the breeding range, loss of habitat in part. Some people would say the cowbirds show that that's part of the issue, but I think we have some confounding factors there. So you have the choice of being three birds. All right, I want you to think about the ranges of those birds. I want you to think about the capacities of those birds, so their ecologies, and then I want us to move over into our experience as human beings. And this is where I'm going to begin to fly, because I'm like, you know, I don't want to belabor the point of maps. Just because I like maps doesn't mean you like maps, but we can talk about habitat suitability, right? We can talk about where you want to be. We can talk about where you want to be, whether you want to be urban or whether you want to be suburban or whether you want exurban, whether you, where do you want to be? Do you want to be out in the middle of nowhere? Is it flyover? Who are you? And we know this, we've got this data set, right? So habitat suitability is not lost on humans. Foraging identity, foraging ability, foraging opportunity. I used to have a fun map up here that talked about the states, and you know, that if you were in South Carolina, really all you ever ate was pimento cheese and barbecue. But that wasn't necessarily instructive and mostly not true, because I only eat barbecue in South Carolina below the fall line. You ought to know that. But we can be serious, and these are food deserts. These are food deserts. Wow, look at this land of opportunity. So, I mean, here we are at taking a bird's eye view of us, looking at our range map. Now, as we're looking at these maps, as you're thinking about which bird that you want to be, and I'll even give you a little bit of leeway. You can choose generalist, you can choose specialist, or you can choose endangered status. How many of you are choosing endangered status? Oh, there we go, right? But think about it, right? If you had the choice, you had the choice. Well, I mean, between the food deserts and within the food deserts, oh, there are places to eat. All right. And I would call them really sort of human ecological traps. So, you know, we can get our bellies full, but no nutrition. We can spend time there, but it's not going to turn out well for us. Wow. We're talking about bird names now. Oh, it's a thing. Until others begin to tell us who we are. Then we want to have something to say about it. So I'm blurring lines, I understand. There's a little bit of anthropomorphizing going on here, but I would like to also invite you to do a little bit of shifting, all right? And thinking about, again, these range maps. Now, I can tell you that, that I've had members of my family move from a state to another state because of laws restricting their ability to love who they wanted to love. Legally love. Let's think about that. Okay, so that map makes a difference. Predation risk? Oh, yes. I mean, we can talk about this very locally, right? You know which side of the tracks to be on after dark. Or that feeling when you're running and perhaps there's something just not right on the trail. And you've got to make a decision of whether to get that last mile in or whether to turn around and go back. These are all range map considerations that as human beings, we ought to be thinking about. Mortality and persistence. Well, you better bet that the insurance companies have a handle on this, right? The actuaries have a handle on where it is we're more likely to just drop dead because we had one too many biscuits and gravy. But if I begin to layer these range maps one on top of the other, we begin to see certain plumage characteristics fall out, right? We begin to see certain characteristics fall out. So then we begin to have some idea, sort of gestalt ourselves into the identities of these birds occupying many of these range maps. Behavior, oh my God, they've got a handle on all of your sins. They don't just magically, CVS doesn't just magically spit out those coupons from your card, right? Oh, they have a handle on this. You do know that the ABV of your Pabst Blue Ribbon varies by the state you're in. You didn't know that? Oh, it does. So when we think about behavior, right, we can think about these birds and the behaviors that they have, birds that are averse, for example, to crossing, sometimes many birds, these large bodies of water, or perhaps an altered landscape, right? Or somebody says, well, it's just the wall, the birds can fly across it. and we can keep those people out in the meantime. So, but thinking about these behaviors, right, and thinking, this is all market analysis. This is all market analysis. So you've been pegged. And it's a little scary. And again, you know, some of this stuff I said, you know, I started doing some of this presentation back in, gosh, probably it was pre-16, certainly. Let's take a moment for the extinction of this bird. Monica Stevens at Humboldt State, and people are still doing this, and it's even more refined now. These are hate maps. This almost looks like a migration map, doesn't it? You know, when, you know, those maps and you're looking and you're like, oh my God, I got to get out tomorrow morning because, well, I'm looking at those. I'm like, oh my God, I got to stay in and out of that space because guess what? These are homophobic tweets, but then these are racist tweets. Now, if you have to pull these maps back, right, and you've got to begin to normalize by population density and those kinds of things. So you begin to look at the pixels, and it's pretty easy to pick up some of these. And on top of this, part of what's happening, people aren't taking the ER versus the A word and saying they're different, because they really aren't in my sense of thinking. All right, so there are errors in all of these. Tweets negatively referring to nigger. Look at this, wow. So if you want to refine these maps, not just by, and this was on a certain night. This was on a certain night. I believe it was on an election night, if I'm not mistaken. So in thinking about these, you can go, as a kid, as a graduate student, I was obsessed with the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. Because here I was trying to get up into Western North Carolina and do my bird work, right? And after I saw a then journalistic reporter named Geraldo Rivera talk about hate groups in the United States, and they went from the stovepipe of Idaho in Hayden Lake, place I still haven't been. I've been to 48 of 50 states. Idaho, I finally visited because of the kindness of Rochelle Johnson. I finally got out there last year, but I'm still not going up in the stovepipe. I mean, there's, you know, I can fly around that. So as a being, I'm making decisions based upon this place. Now, sometimes I make decisions based upon a single individual who happens to provide a respite, a resting spot. Maybe it's like a backyard patch, and from above, I hear the water drip, 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 and I see enough there to give me enough cover that I can rest safely, hopefully, refuel. Got to watch out for the outdoor cats. Or so in this instance, though, thinking about these hate maps, thinking about the Southern Poverty Law Center, and that next to my research site, one of the most virulent white supremacist groups showed up. So the proposal had been done, funded. This was the Wine Springs Creek project. Some of you may have known about that project. And I changed study sites because of a spot on a map. Now, I was told that I would not get my PhD posthumously. Someone joked about that with me. So it's a little different, though, even in the sites that I eventually ended up choosing, going in to do your point counts on a Friday, getting your point counts done, then going back to those spots on a Monday and finding KKK on the gate. But I've got to think about those 10-minute, 50-meter radius point counts and what I'm hearing. That is that climbing song of prairie warblers up the chromatic scale, or was that somebody behind me? So all of these maps we can think about. By the way, you can get into your Facebook. This is an old one. You can get into your Facebook and they range you. All right. So I say all this, and I break it down into these eco-socio-psychological impacts. That is, barriers to being, human and otherwise. In other words, range restrictions. This is a lot of what we think about, range restrictions. I mean, I can pull up all kinds of maps. I can pull up these maps that show where people were killed, unarmed people were killed, and then I can delve into that data and I can say, you know what? I really don't need to be out late in this place. And I need to tell my son not to be out late in this place. One of the things that always amazed me when I did tours down in South Texas is that we would get to Southmost Preserve. Any of you ever been there? It's a Nature Conservancy Southmost, and you got to go through the wall. You would get, well, first of all, Border Patrol comes on the bus, right? And and they go pretty quickly through. But then you get two questions. You would get two questions. What is that? Asking about that structure. You would get those questions. What is that? And then the second question was we would get, but do the birds on the other side count? So, I mean, that's an issue. And I don't care how much we love birds to not be aware of this landscape. And maybe it has some impact on roadrunners or ferruginous pygmy, whatever it has an impact on that can't fly across it or is unwilling to run around, whatever, that sometimes it's necessary to take the binoculars down to see the larger context, I think. And I think it's part of sort of this myopic tendency that we've had in some quarters to not see the world. And because we can't see the world, we don't see that so many of these birds are disappearing because we do have them on our list for the year, right? And nobody's named it Martha or Incas or Booming Ben yet. You hear me describe myself as a cultural ornithologist, and I think we all ought to be, because part of what we need to be considering is how other people see not just birds, but how other people see land, how what we are so willing to call natural resources, people just see as nature. All right, so in thinking about those issues, it's important, I think, to look at the maps, to look at those swaths of land. I think we're going to have to reconsider, in many ways, our definitions of wild, wildness, and wilderness. I think those are all going to be on the table for debate coming up pretty soon. We have to think about current issues, right, of places and people whose ranges have been severely restricted and whose very existences are being questioned. Wow, is water a right? Clean water? I mean, same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same breath, same fate. Do birds watch us and say, look, those are humans in the coal mine? Get out. Don't want to be there, right? Certainly, in some sort of fantastical story, they could say, oh yeah, that community down there in New Orleans, see how close they are to those levees? See how they're always downwind from toxic flumes? Those people are endangered. Those people are imperiled. But if we come back into our human skins, we can see that. And I'll tell you a little bit of a story here in a second. I mean, we have all this, right? We have hate, just hate for anybody, everybody. Choose your hate. This makes the decisions for many of us, where I go, where I don't go. So range overlap. you know, I love this map because this is everyone, well, not everyone, most, you know, participate in the census, and we look at the census, and this is Black America. That's what this range map is. But then you see that concentration. You see that southeastern concentration. But are we thinking about that concentration of my people when we're thinking about red knots or swallowtail kites or painted buntings, or we're thinking about landfall for migrating songbirds? Are we thinking about those issues? Now, I can be real specific, and EJ knows this. She's in these spaces. She sees these spaces. This is what people in South Carolina, part of it, they call the corridor of shame. This is the I-95 corridor for the most part, but the I-95 corridor is such a rich place for birds. I mean, you've got Francis Marion National Forest nearby, so you can see pine woods, sparrows there. You can see red cockaded woodpeckers. You can maybe hear the occasional northern bobwhite, occasionally. But you get on some of those rivers, like, what is it, EJ, the Black River, and some of those places, and swallowtail kites. And this map has changed. We desperately need another breeding bird atlas in South Carolina. John Seeley did this, what was it, 30 years ago? 30 years ago. But I can tell you that if you want to see swallowtail kites in abundance, go to Allendale, South Carolina. Go to Allendale, South Carolina post-breeding, and you have these large ag fields, and they're the swallowtail kites and the Mississippi kites. And people are going into those places, especially Allendale, because you just pull up alongside the road at almost any field. There's even a kite festival there. And you don't have to go into the field. You can stay on the public road, so you don't have to trespass. You don't have to pay anybody to look in their field. You know, and here I am with my very expensive binoculars and my pretty expensive camera, and taking advantage of this and seeing these birds. I mean, how many of you have been around swallowtail kites to the point where you can hear those birds' wings pinioning as they come down? Or just, I mean, you can't pick one out. You know, EJ lives in that world, but to be, I mean, it's just, I mean, hear these birds swirling like swallows in Allendale, South Carolina, one of the poorest counties in America. So you can literally carry around your neck and over your shoulder an average income of most people in Allendale. But because there's really no infrastructure there to say, okay, you know what, farmer X or landowner Y, we want to look in your field or your pasture and watch these birds. You know, how can we make life better for you by doing that? But people get fantastic shots of swallowtail kites in Allendale. And because birding is non-consumptive, everybody knows that, you can leave feeling good about yourself. So that's the cultural ornithology. I figured out that I could no longer go into the low country of South Carolina as I was trying to get students to understand how to tell the difference between mottle ducks, black ducks, and mallard hens, that I could not talk about that or the possibility of black rails without talking about how that landscape even came to be. You ever been on one of those trips where you go and people never mention what you're looking at? Right? It's sort of like being in the Black Hills and ignoring those heads as a golden eagle soars over, and you're trying to describe it by the particular pine as opposed to the nostril of one of those people. So it's important to take our binoculars down as we think about merging, as we think about the art of communicating the importance of these birds, the urgency of them. And people will say, well, yeah, but that's history, that's the past. I can tell you that those forests, the scientists can tell you who've done this work, first of all, they're finding way more rice fields with LIDAR and other techniques than they ever thought existed. But before those were rice fields, many of these were what? Cypress tupelo swamp. And in Caw plantation, they're letting some of these go back so people can see what happens ecologically with that succession. But guess what? Those people who built that and who brought the technology here to control the tide to within an inch or two, do you know that those lands are capturing carbon at rates that are equivalent to primary forest? So why aren't we telling that story along with the birds that are being listed? Why aren't we telling the history of these places? Instead of calling them enslaved, we have signage that says these were servants that were brought over here as beasts of burden, and the technology to move this water across the landscape for which they recruited came from Amsterdam. So to me, if I can't tell the truth about humans, how can I believe anything about birds? And it's not revisionist. So I can spread out from swallowtail kites to wood storks to black rails to painted buntings to pine wood sparrows to red cockaded woodpeckers. And we can tell these stories. I can tell the stories in the Southlands. If I'm in some of these pine stands where there are cat faces, that is, these marks where people were scarring the tree to gather navel stores, turpentine, tree sap, and the like. It's sort of like the cowboy story, you know, and estimates are as high as 1 in every 4 being black on certain trail drives, that those foresters in those forests were frequently enslaved people, convict labor, and others. So how do I ask the questions of connecting people to nature if I deny their connections to it? And we wonder why our movement is monolithic. Okay? So in thinking about all of these things, here's another range map, and you can take this range map brown, right? And so this map of 2016, which seems like so long ago, right? And I'm not going to say which range is which range. I think the map probably says which range is which range. So considerations. Here are a couple of take-home messages. Science is scriptural. Did I just say that? I did. And I say it because there's so many denying the data. There's so many that conveniently deny the data. But I think we really have to be conscious of doing our best science and presenting our multiple working hypotheses as it were. One of the things that I've seen increasingly at the academy is more siloing, because most universities, including my own, they are in and they just say it now, we're in a revenue generating stage. So I don't know, is Songbird research bringing in millions? I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it's being funded at that level. But in order to push the agenda of conservation, we got to make some people feel some kind of way about it, so that even if the dollars aren't flowing towards it, maybe the sentiments are. So that means as I teach policy, I talk to students about advocacy. People say, well, but you can't do that as a scientist. You can't be an advocate, really? I think that's where we've lost ground and we've been fooled into that. No, it doesn't mean that I go out and that I bias my sample. It doesn't mean that I don't rigorously gather my data, analyze the data, go through the peer review process, but I damn sure better fight for what I'm fighting for. Or otherwise, we're going to find ourselves unable to even do the research to tell the truth. Widening the audience concerned with the environment and conservation by including their stories. Again, I just told that story, right? So it's not just a matter of inclusion, but it's also a matter of sometimes listening, of being empathetic, and letting those stories evolve. Again, I sort of tell the story of fishing, and fishing is an entry point for a lot of people. Why is fishing an entry point to a lot of folks? Well, for me growing up, there was just a cane pole and a line and a red wiggler worm. And I could catch dinner with that. Now, was I looking at a slot limit? No. So there's a large portion of a southern populace that is finding sustenance in nature in a different way. But we don't pay attention to that because they don't have the right kind of gear, and they're not doing things as we have prescribed them to do. So we need to pay attention to that. Connect the well-being of those who are impacted by what happens to the canaries in the coal mine. That is, again, I think, a reciprocal sort of relationship, but pushing the perception beyond polar bears. And I always say that was the worst thing that we did for climate change, is that we made it all about drowning polar. Now, first of all, I don't want to offend any polar bears, none. But we did not make it a global issue. It became an issue of people and an animal that most will only ever see at a zoo or on television, and sort of, and so we didn't have the opportunity, we didn't take the opportunity to talk about the chronic pulmonary disease in young people of color and how it visits them. And when we want to think about the total of us, how many people have watched the weather on a July or August day and they say, don't go outside? The air is too bad for you to go outside. Have you thought about that? And so think about somebody with an asthmatic condition who can't afford inhalers, and they're living downwind of some toxic stream in the first place. So again, when we take our binoculars down, it allows us to see a wider view. One of the things that's been troubling is that conservation and environmentalism have been at loggerheads, right? So where do the turbines go? Oh, you don't want the turbines there? That means you don't want clean energy. Well, no, I said I want clean energy, but does it have to be in the flight path of those birds? Can we think about where else it might be? Can we think about the technology for the turbines that might be less invasive, less fatal to those birds? So I think, and Paul and I talked about this, finding ways to mend some of these gaps that have come about, and birding beyond the binoculars. So I want to ask the question here, as we talk about these declines over the past 50 years, if I were, again, and this is dangerous territory for me because I really did not like calculus or much to do with. So let's think about the axes, right? And if I just had, I just operated with linear mind, and I look at declines, right? Declines would be like that, wouldn't they? For many species. I mean, almost. What would birding look like? Whoa. If all those people concerned about birds, millions of people, why are all these birds declining? Who's advocating for these birds? That's a question I want to sort of leave out there to linger, because I think we need to ask ourselves that question. We need to ask ourselves, with the most popular outdoor avocation in North America, at least top 3. And you even look at what happened over the pandemic, and people who began to identify as birders or bird watchers, even in their backyards. How do we leverage those millions? How do we leverage just a small portion of those people into advocating for birds? How does that happen? I would argue it's not likely to happen with the data. And so this is what I do. So I sort of, this hard right turn for me, and it wasn't a turn away, but it was a turn in understanding that as I stood before classes, there had to be a different way to communicate what was going on. You know, this whole idea of just letting the data be the data and the students and the public would get it. If you've ever been to any kind of state house hearing, Senate hearing, or anything like that, and I've taken my student to them, they quickly understand how little the data matters. They quickly understand. And so we have to be able to tell the stories. And we have to be able to tell the stories with the science. And so I've spent a lot of my, the past, I don't know, decade or so thinking about many of these issues. One of the first was on a trip to South Africa, right? Where we saw fabulous things, but barely talked about apartheid, even as Black people moved out of line to let white students in front of them. Now, these students were born after, right? So they couldn't possibly be impacted by history. They just knew that they frequently got to move ahead in line because Black folks just moved out of line. So as we were counting birds, we weren't counting humanity and thinking about that. So it sort of started with that and then went on from there. So, you know, we just celebrated MLK Day a couple of days ago. I try to have my students think about, specific dates aren't important as much as trying to bring things into a decade. And I look at that decade of the 60s, and do you realize how close the environmental movement, the burgeoning environmental movement that Rachel Carson in large part started, and the civil rights movement, do you realize they were moving towards one another? Right? King, in fact, was in Memphis, and some of these were environmental issues, because you know why they were environmental issues? Because garbage people were talking about not taking the garbage up. So stuff was about to get sour. So in thinking about all of these things, even thinking about, you know, thinking about John James Audubon. Why does anybody need to think about John James Audubon? My goodness. Well, John James Audubon is really central to a lot of what it is that we do and how we think about birds. But I'm always shocked, not just at sort of who Audubon was in his own words, but that so many people don't understand in order to paint the birds, he had to shoot the birds. Now, I'm a hunter, so I kill and eat things. But John James Audubon, if you read his biographies, when he went into that chimney swift roost, have you ever read that? How many people have read Audubon's bio? Oh, he wrote extensively about it. So he found a roost. Even at that time, it was rare. He found this cavernous hollow, sort of scouted it out. You know, they dug their way into this big hollow tree, this big snag. And I mean, Audubon was astounded at the number of swifts there. So how many did he take? Like 100. Like 100. He was like a weasel in a hen house, right? There was this frenzy. And then he would talk about how beautiful, and occasionally he would be sort of kind of remorseful, but he did terrible things to animals beyond, and he ate some of them, but mostly he didn't. So these debates that I have are an artful way of trying to bring the conversation back to sort of this blurry line between the present and the past, that we need to think about who it is that we are, how we treat birds, how we treat wildness, but how we also treat one another. So that's certainly a story of humanity. I'm very proud to have been a part of what went on down at DeVoe Bank. How many of you know about that? Wimbrels. probably largest eastern roost, at least that's been found. And Felicia Sanders finding that because a high tide caught her out there on that sand spit. But then just this passion to see, and even when she wasn't believed, to meet Andy Johnson. A lot of you know Andy from Cornell. To meet Andrew Johnson up there in the Arctic, and for them as he's studying Wimbrels, and then to come to this connection and to be in this space, in this place, caused me to redefine wildness, because DeVoe Bank is so unstable that humans couldn't do anything with it. But they still want to go there and hit golf balls. Once they found out the birds were there, they want to go there and want to hit golf balls, and they want to fish from the spit. But the Wimbrels claim this wildness as it emerges, and then they find some other place, maybe further down the coast. And so all of these are stories that help us, I think, generate not just head, but heart towards this whole idea of conservation. Folks in Charleston began to find out about DeVoe Bank, that this was in their backyard, that there was this superlative just mere minutes from King Street and all that hustle and bustle. Folks began to understand, you know what, my ancestors had a part in this being what it is. Bitter as that was, what I'm looking out over, I have stake in. I have a part in this environment. I have a part in this world. It's not just for people who can afford the most expensive binoculars and glass to go and look at it. It's not for the people who just tour it. I don't have to know the name of every bird, but I know that what happened there, I'm a part of. So I'm really proud to have this as a part of my career, because again, Road to Recovery feels different to me. It feels different because the aim is to what? Recovery. And first, we're recognizing that birds are declining, billions. And when you think about that, as I write, fathoming billions, I think about grains of sand washing to and fro, but to think about birds, flocks of birds, birds that we know we don't see as many of in our lifetimes. We can talk about Christmas bird counts. We can talk about what we see in our backyards. We can talk about what we no longer hear. But all of it comes back to heart. So this last, there's actually a, there's a link. We don't have to play that now. Nope. We've been going a while, but what I wanted to, you see how technologically adept I am. So there are two links there that are just sort of personal story. I'm going to ask Paul and others to provide that, and you can watch that at your leisure. But this more important story that I wanted to tell here harkens back to 2013. Oh, what a glorious, glorious, glorious time that was, because there were snowy owls all over the place. And what we see here, I think there's a pointer here somewhere.
Yeah.
See this group? Yeah. So this is Carrie Samus, who ran a program up in Maryland on the Eastern Shore called Coastal Stewards. This is Harrison, who later became a graduate student. But these are all mostly high school students, Black and brown, mostly, many of whose parents' bird stories were that a bus would arrive in the morning to take them to the chicken plant to kill chickens. That's a bird story, right? But here they live within an hour's drive of a national seashore, and most of them had never been there. And so rather than have them pick up trash like most people wanted them to do, Carrie would carry them out to places. She had them assisting in some efforts with wader counts, for example. They assisted in banding brown pelicans, all under supervision, all on the up and up. And so on this particular and this was in February, and any of you who've been on acetate in February, first of all, it's great. It's great otter weather, right? You know, and they're out there bobbing up and down. But on this particular day, these young people, Carrie brought them out, and we saw not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 snowy owls that day. What do you think that did for their ranges? Suddenly, it wasn't just about Berlin. It wasn't just about the situation that you may have been in that wasn't so good, but on that day to see, and initially to see, you know, some people not so interested, but then they began to learn, well, where'd these birds come from? What are they doing down here? You know, these questions. And so to see these ranges of individuals expanded by the wonder of a snowy owl was amazing to me. And so no matter what they go on to do in life, I think this is a time that they would remember. Maybe one or two of them ends up in, I don't know, a town council meeting, or has questions about whether or not we should dump effluent into the water, or whether or not this plant should come here and not pay taxes to pollute. They've seen one bird, 5 of them. It's amazing. But again, you have a person who also activated that. So I think that's the power of conservation. I think that's the power of our potential activism, if we choose to stand on that business. So I'm grateful, so very grateful to Paul, so very grateful to Ken and Pete, to so many who have allowed me to have a voice in this road to recovery effort. So I'm grateful for the time. I'm grateful for your attention, and let's get at it. Thank you. You have time for questions today? If usually. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great. Thank you.
Now that we've got your attention, he'll take questions.
Yeah,
You've got to have some.
please. I promise 100% response. It could be a raised eyebrow.
There's one way up there. Yep. There's
Yes.
a mic, hopefully it's on. Hey, Ashley.
Hello.
Okay. So you said that there's something that's exciting about Road to Recovery that feels different to you. Can you tell us more? What's making you excited about this?
First there was, you know, that it was born in an urgent time. I think is part of it. So it was incubated during a time when we were questioning our own existence. So, there is the existential sort of origin of it, but then to think about other lives beyond us, it wasn't sort of in this larger, as I said, untangible context. So, you know, when I've mentioned some of this and talked about it, there's not been any recoil from it, right? And to say, let's wait, we have the data. We have the data. And now it's about telling these stories and about getting these groups going and getting the experts to weigh in. But then beyond that, it has felt, again, to me, more urgent. It's felt more urgent. And an urgency for me is something that's palpable. And because it's been approached in that way, we're here, right? But there have been other things that have happened. And so that to me feels very different than, and not criticizing Partners in Flight at all. It was a different time. But I think we've all been brought by something or another to think about our existences in a very different and critical way. And to hear the word billions, to hear that, or to hear, to talk to somebody who doesn't know a brown thrasher from a brown creeper, but to ask you, where are all the birds? I remember I used to see, there used to be a flock of robins that came through here and I could count on them. And you can do all the talking and hand waving you want to about, annual, seasonal variation and those kinds of things that we would see naturally. But then people say, well, but no, it's, And so listening to that feels different. And it feels, for me, I feel personally and professionally sort of validated in going the route that I have gone and not excluded and put on the side to say, well, that's just so much woo-woo. So we need a little bit of woo-woo in this. But I think the woo-woo comes down to, and I've heard other people use the 4-letter word love. So if you think about where we are, and if you want to take the exercise, I have my students do it, go through and count the number of times that Leopold uses that word. So to me, again, it feels different. It feels like a movement more than an organization. And I think we have to have movements. And people are frightened by that word. But I don't think anybody here is frightened by the idea of a movement to keep billions from becoming none. We have that story written. Her name is Martha. So that's how it feels different. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But if you've been around as long as I have, it's sort of like university restructures. They begin to repeat themselves. And this is not a repeat. This is not a repeat. This is taking what has been learned and bringing it forward and approaching it in some different ways, I think. And I think as it evolves, I think there's more opportunity for people to see this as a conservation movement, because the questions that are being asked are hard questions. And nobody yet has been able to tell me really why that graph of birders versus bird declines looks like it does. There's a weird sort of economy and psychology going on there that we need to address. So, and I want to do it as long as R2R will have me. I want to do it through this forum. It's a chance to bring scientists and others together in a way I think that we haven't.
Thank you, and we're really happy to have you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thanks very much. Really, really great. I was struck on that slide where you had inclusion, empathy, and evocative stories.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're used to, in recent years, hearing the phrase diversity, equity, inclusion, environmental justice, but you chose to insert the word empathy there and evocative stories. And I think empathy is extraordinarily important if one is striving to gather people to embrace conservation. But I would love to hear a little bit more about what that means to you and how you might envision Road to Recovery thinking about empathy.
I mean, empathy to me is it's an aspirational word. right? And the whole idea of putting yourself or trying to put yourself in a place to understand what it must be like. And the way that I have gotten at some of this, Lynn, is, with some of the birding while black stuff. And I don't expect someone who is not black to maybe they've had some of these experiences in some sort of way. But the empathy comes across when I began to talk about this feeling that I may have in certain places, or my ability. I have an ability to identify, when I'm being tracked. And then a 20-year-old white woman says, like I feel when I'm jogging, past a certain hour or past a place that I've never, then there's a moment of empathy. And then there's this intersection of understanding what it's like to be prey. Right? And so, and empathy, I think, is sometimes ephemeral. It's not anything that I think sort of stands just solidly between individuals forevermore. Amen. But I think there are opportunities for us to see common in one another. Paul and I were talking about sort of the frustration in hunters and bird watchers not understanding common plight. I mean, I've had people in a room full of birders get up and walk out when I just start talking about Pittman Robertson and license formulation for hunting license and formulation for conservation in the States, and people don't want to hear it. So I think that the empathy, they're like little nuts, little acorns maybe, and they're there, but we have to sort of snuff around for them and find them, and be willing to chew on them sometimes. So I think those points, again, one of them for me is thinking about that connection between people who we term as consumptive and a group who sees themselves as non-consumptive. And to be able to bridge that gap would be just a little bit. You're not asking for a marriage here. What you're asking for is to people to see some common ground to be gained in what they do. But there are way too many folks carrying binoculars who do not understand the duck stamp, who don't understand, well, conservation right now is being funded a certain way. Let's come up with some ideas to fund it otherwise. Oh, but you don't want to pay the tax on the binoculars. Okay. We've been around that, remember? So in thinking about that, how do we come together? Maybe the two of us come together through, Land and Water Conservation Act, right? Maybe we come together through some of those things, but I think there have to be specific and intentional measures to point out. We say, you know what? You guys are already sort of in the same boat. You're in the same boat. One's in the bow paddling this way and the other's in the stern paddling the other way. Where do you go? In circles. So how do we have a little conversation mid-boat and say, you know what? Let's both get in the middle and we can paddle somewhere. And if you decide to go somewhere else after we get to shore, you can go that way. But first, we got to get the hell out of these circles so that we can get somewhere. And to me, that's why a place like this is so important, right? I don't know of any other place like it. I was so proud that this is, the convening place, but I've seen magic work here organizationally with a very large organization. And for a while it worked, and it spawned some other efforts that are now working. So that's how I see empathy as being important. I mean, I think, for a while, to me, so many efforts of the diversity, inclusion, and engagement, I said they were where ideas went to die because people, you know, the same people were going. The people who needed to go weren't going to those meetings. And so to begin to cast, instead of these sort of broad ideas, when you say those words, what do they mean? When I say empathy, that brings into this conversation another level of engagement that we have to have. You know, everybody's seen the meme. In order for me to empathize, I got to get down in the hole with you. I can't stand up on the rim and say, oh, that's too bad that you're down there. Let me give you a hand up, but let me not get too close lest I fall in the hole with you, right? Empathy means that at some point we begin to engage at a similar level, so then we can work ourselves out of that hole together. So that's how I see it. I know, again, it's aspirational and maybe seems out of reach, but I think it's part of the hope that I have, right? Brief story, I did a podcast a year and a half ago or whatever, but I did a podcast and was told not to do this podcast by several. I was told not to do this podcast by some of my writer friends. I was told not to do the podcast by a lot of my birder friends. The podcast was called Meat Eater. And so, so here I was out talking to Stephen Ranella. And Ranella's interviewed a lot of people. And he's interviewed people that I have nothing in common with politically or in many other ways. But I took this challenge and I did this podcast, and Ranella had read more than most people read about me, and he had read my stuff, and he knew, and he was asking really intelligent questions. And even before the show, with all the sort of stuff that goes on, he got down to brass tacks, and here they were talking about waterfowl numbers. And he was checking people on their homework. Well, did you check this source? What did they say about, well, yeah, the flight is down for Gadwall and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, really? Yeah, I was just down there. And they seem to be, yeah, but they're saying I was like, wow. So I did the podcast, and I started getting notes from people that I didn't know were in my readership. I got a letter from a guy in a combine who was listening to a book on tape while he was getting the crop in. Like, wow. And I've had several of those. So what was the moment of empathy? Well, I had written a chapter on a deer hunt, but I had also taken a chance to talk to somebody I wouldn't normally maybe talk to, or if I had listened to everybody else tell me that I should not have done it. So it's not something I regret doing. To the contrary, it taught me a lesson, you know, that sometimes you have to take the risk, and empathy is a risk. Because again, you know, if you have to find yourself on the level of someone else, sometimes that means going into that hole. And I think it's something in conservation that we have to do if we're going to involve more folks, a broader audience of people who have stake, rather than saying to them, well, if I could only get you to the places I go to see nature, you would be so much better off. Meanwhile, ignoring the nature in their places or the nature of their places. So that's empathy. Empathy to me is, instead of inviting somebody to go birding at my favorite spot, to ask them where they might like to go. Right? Empathy to me is not discounting when they call a cardinal a red bird, because it is a red bird. So there are those moments when we don't ID shame because somebody has mistaken a house finch for a purple finch, and get all up in arms about that. And we cast them off into the hell of misidentification. I mean, really, there are whole groups of people who are intimidated because they misidentified something. We all know them. How many people in here, by the way, identify themselves as birders? How many people identify themselves as bird watchers? How many people have ever been to a bird festival? Okay. That's an interesting phenomenon to me. It's interesting because when I started going, I thought that I would find a lot of you there, but I didn't. It was like, I was like super minority, like ornithologists, like looking around, like where are they? But it is such a ripe place, I think, for conservation. But in all honesty, not many people seem interested in conservation bird festivals, right? They don't want their good time ruined with a bad story of billions of birds declining. But one of the most beautiful things I saw at the bird festival was at Biggest Week, and there had just been one of these Kirtland's warbler stampedes. And it's Kirtland's warblers, I think they know the boardwalk, and so they would do stuff like be like at the top of a sycamore. I mean, really, just weird stuff. But anyway, there's this guy who has, you know, one of these Octavio Audubons, and he's got this as his field guide on the boardwalk, and he's got it open to was it red-winged starling, which is red-winged blackbird. And do you know how many red-winged blackbirds you see in the Great Black Swamp in May? A lot. They're declining, right? But this guy's there on the boardwalk, his book resting, and he is just watching this red-winged blackbird and looking back and forth between that red-winged blackbird to see what he sees and what somebody else saw, what John James Audubon saw. And the maelstrom of migration was all around him, but he was centered on that one bird. And that was a moment for me of somebody just noticing that one bird. And I call that personal ornithology. So that's a way to press, I think. You know, if you ask people during the pandemic, what birds did you see in your backyard? Many of them, I mean, learned a lot, and they could sort of quote chapter and verse way more birds than you would think. But other people would say, oh, cardinals. I just started watching cardinals. And to me, that's important because then they're at a level of noticing another being. And at noticing that other being, then they're at a different level of concern. And that different level of concern of caring for another being brings you one step closer to empathy. So if we can aspire to that, I can't be a bird, right? But I ask people to think about flying in a metaphorical sky. Some of us have done it with sliding glass doors. Some of us have walked into glass. Yeah. But not with fatal results. Right? So, and I think to that effect, helping younger people understand that what we do has feeling in it. You know, when we talk about who we are as professionals, especially as scientists, that we don't cast ourselves as heartless data gatherers. That being a naturalist, to me, first starts with being a noticer, which is maybe the puddle that made you pause, and there were these black dots, these commas sort of swimming around in it that magically appeared, and you're like, oh my God, spontaneous generation. This puddle wasn't here, these things weren't here. And then you go home. For me, I got in the encyclopedia, talked to people, and suddenly, there's sexual reproduction, right? Oh my God, these are, oh, yeah, so they came from that. So that's noticing there's a little bit of science creeping in, but then I go back and I'm like watching these things and I'm like, oh, there's this thing called metamorphosis, and these things are going to change. Maybe I'm going to take a couple home in a jar. I'm going to watch them, and you get to see their little legs develop. You get to see their tails reabsorbed, and you're like, ah, these little froglets are developing. I better put them back. Or maybe you get concerned because you're like, oh man, it hasn't rained in a while. The book tells me that it's going to take these many days for these guys to get out of here. What's going to happen? Then you start paying attention to what? The weather forecast. And how the weather forecast maybe affects your puddle. But then oh my God, I got to tell daddy, I got to tell mama not to drive through that puddle. You're a conservationist. And I think I can remember those kinds of incidences as a child. I was a weird one who told people in second grade I wanted to be an ornithologist, and they thought I wanted to be an orthodontist. And so, like, what is that? But I think that we also have to pay attention, not just to that adult sector. I don't think we've been paying enough attention to that part of wonder and awe in a tadpole that stops you at a puddle. Before we jerk the feather out of their hands and tell them that they're breaking the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, let them take a second to feel it, then you jerk it away and tell them. You don't do that. We've all seen that too, right? These opportunities for learning are out there, and part of that empathetic sort of response is for you to drop back to child's mind. For you to drop back to child's mind and say, oh, and to get at that level. And creaky knees and all, sometimes it means squatting down and being face to face with someone or something that you haven't been face to face with in a while. So that's sort of the way that I see it. Maybe I'm devolving, but I think for me, the wonder of it is still these birds dodging falling stars. It's still these birds and, this whole idea of Zugenruhe and what's going through, a warbler's mind at that point, on the Yucatan. And is it all weather? Is it all wind that makes me take that short jump over to Cuba and island hop up the peninsula? Or what tells me, oh, that's 600 miles to the Gulf Coast Cheniers, and I gotta do that, right? And we say, well, it's hardwired, it's instinctual, it's this, it's that. We don't know. And so that gap between what we can understand through science and what we don't, to me, that's wonder. And I sort of live in that wonder of birds. Because the question now that DeVoe Bank got knocked out by that storm, people are like, oh, what are the Wimbrel going to do? Wimbrel are probably going to hopefully they're going to find someplace else, but it also leads us to say, you know what, we need to protect barrier islands. We need to think about those places, those spaces that make birds safe, and those barrier islands are also make us safer in a world of increasing storms. So those are moments of empathy where, I can be one with the Wimbrel. Wow, the alarm is going off, so I guess
I hear
better
that
go.
behind us, but that's not an alarm. I don't know what that means. I've got a statement and then a question for you, okay? My statement is, I wish you were one of the instructors at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in 1978 when I attended the Federal Law Enforcement. They could have learned a lot about that feather story and how those are opportunities, right, for some education and some learning as opposed
We talk
to,
about why you can't keep it.
yeah. and not ticketing.
Right.
But anyway, that's not what the point of that training was. But my question is, one of the best communicators I know is you. And you've done it in many forms, in many ways, but you fundamentally are a scientist.
Mhm.
Fundamentally, many, if not all, consider themselves scientists. And we sometimes get lost in the data. And I want to hear more about the importance of the story.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So we do that.
Yeah.
Then we'll close it.
And it's a bird story, Paul.
Okay.
So this is a bird story of sort of immense beaked proportions. So I wasn't tenured yet. So it's a while back, but I taught a non-game wildlife management class, which I had sort of been given. But then my big class was conservation biology. I was teaching out of Meth and Carroll, that big tome. And so I finished teaching one morning. I taught the first class, and then I had a brief break before my con bio class. And I was walking to my office, and one of my students, who's now university faculty himself, Brand Cromer, comes to me in the hall. He said, Doc, did you hear? Did you hear? I said, what, Brand? He said, they found it. I said, they found what? And he's like, they found the ivory bill. I said, what? He said, yeah, they found it. And he started talking. And so I have a few minutes. So this is going to really date it. So I go into my office. I get Netscape 2.0, Franken, might have been 4. And there it is, right? It's this story. It's this story about this bird. And so I go to my com bio class, and I mean, gosh, I think actually at that time I was going over sort of principles of reserve design and SLOS, single large or several small, right? And you can see people's eyes just glazing over daily, right? As you're going through this stuff. And I go in and I pull this up on the screen, and I talk about my fascination with gone birds, with ivory bills and Carolina parakeets, and especially Beckman's swamp cane warbler. And I'm telling them this story of hope. And I read Emily Dickinson's Hope is the Thing with Feathers. And I got very emotional, and I teared up. And my students reacted. I wasn't crying to try to get a reaction, but it was just to see something different from them in that moment of this discovery, right? There was this moment of joy. And that feeling, I know it lifted me. I think it lifted others into a place, whatever has happened down the line, it lifted them into a place understanding that heart has a place in this. And so I couldn't go back from that, right? And and so I would get all the questions. We used to have this call-in show, and then suddenly there are ivory bills at suet feeders. And and I learned during that time how to talk people into pileated, right? So, but it became for me an affair of it had always been an affair of the heart, but I had spent so much time trying, just putting the data out there and what the theory was espousing, and that this is the way we think. We have the science that tells us that this is happening, and mostly this is how we're failing at it from a conservation standpoint. That story, that was one that changed me. And one from kind of another point of view of someone telling me a story. There's a young biologist who now he's the biologist at Nemours Plantation. Some of you know where Nemours is. And Nemours, it's important because Nemours is on the Combee. And as you travel 17 from Charleston through Jacksonboro, like you're going towards Beaufort, that bridge right before you cross into Beaufort County is where Harriet Tubman liberated almost 800 enslaved people. That bridge is called the Harriet Tubman Memorial Bridge. But Bo Bauer is the biologist there and has done so much good work. But Bo was an undergrad, and he was one of these older undergrads, kind of literally grizzled, guy with a red beard. He didn't say a whole lot in class, but he was always there. And I had done this talk one day about formulation, funding, conservation. I talked about, it was in policy. And so, most of the stuff, again, that people's eyes glaze over about, he listened to, because I advocate buying a hunting license. Even if you aren't a hunter, I say, buy it, rip it up. I have a rubber stamp that says birder for conservation. You can stamp it on there and show a hunter who says, I pay for it. You say, well, I did too. And I didn't think anybody was listening, but I came back from lunch that day and Bo was waiting at my office. And he said, Doc, he said, you got a minute? And I said, yeah, sure, Bo, come on in. And he came in and he pulled out his hunting license. I said, my first one. And that struck me. And I was like, so, and he wasn't working at Nemours yet. But I said, so are you going to get out this season? And this was spring, so I'm in Turkey. And Bo said, he said, not yet. I don't think I can kill anything else right now. Bo, I didn't know they made these people. Combat sniper swimmer who has served, I think it was Iraq and Afghanistan. So for years, here he was, even as a professional, taking people on hunts, but not being able to shoot. His life meant something else to him in a different way. And so that just hits me. And I tell his story, man, he is such a great example of a professional and how he operates. And I've had such great conversations with him about the land, how he sees it, how he sees conservation. One of Bo's great achievements is that he kind of figured out a way to build it, and some black rails came. Yep, he did. And so that to me, again, is sort of another way of communicating, but here is one-on-one. I'm not a veteran. I haven't had those experiences, but it really put me in a place to be thankful for Bo and who he is, but also understanding that who he is part of who he was, and that there weren't things that weren't pleasant about that. Man, this is one of the most peace-loving people I know. So that's a story, again, to me, that bears telling. So that because this is also a vulnerable conversation. It's a vulnerable conversation. And we can't be hard tack about conservation. Likewise, I've heard students, primarily young men, out in the lobby, I've heard them talking about doing really bad things out in the field hunting wise, right? And I would tell them, I'd wait till we get in class and I would repeat the conversation. Yeah, it must have been a lot of fun gut shooting that doe in the dark, and you didn't even go after her. And they sit there, they tell on themselves. I never mention any names. But if we don't call out the bad stories, then we allow them to persist. And if we allow them to persist in young people, then that's an insidious kind of neglect, I think. So as I'm telling stories, I'm also listening, trying to listen to what others have to say. And sometimes I can be in the place that they are. I can't be in the place that Bo is. But I do know I have an emotional response every time there's a dead deer, and I've done it. Right? I have an emotional response when there's a hermit thrush laying at the base of a window in my house. I'm like, how do I? So I got to do better. I got to do better. So I think there's scales to this, but this is a highly, if any student sort of indicates that the other way I out counsel them or try to at least illuminate or to them is that if they're like, well, I just really don't like working with people and I want to be oh my gosh. The challenge is the human management. You give so many of these other beings a chance and they do amazing things, amazing things. It's that human component that I've had to learn how to communicate with and how to manage. And so I tell people, my Myers-Briggs, INFP, I'm not for people. That's what, but really, what I have come to learn is that we do share, what we share with wild things is critical and it's our survival. And if we don't pay attention, it's going to mean the demise of so many of us. And it can't just be about some hubris of saving humanity, because nature is going to be nature, right? It's what we do to sort of pervert it, but also what we do to kind of, I think, to try to do better and have some, in the end, it really is a moral ground we stand on. And that's a dangerous place to be on moral ground and say what? What do you say about that? Is a bird just a bird? Are some birds better than other birds? So, I think there's so many questions of ethics, Paul, but those stories of ethics and ethos and how we are, we have to tell personal stories about it. We have to tell those personal stories. So thank you for asking that question. And thank you again, for being patient. I'm going to ask, did they have like bison in the cafeteria again jeez. Yeah, I figured they did because I missed it. So no, I'm just kidding. But I really am, I'm grateful for this place. I'm grateful for the space and being able to talk to you in this way. And I hope to be able to continue it going forward. So thank you very much.
It was sitting next to a mountain.
Yeah.
A Chevy Malibu. You know, I think those do well in the snow. I mean, there's the lounge and where we are, all the leaves. You just gotta put it on the
Accelerator and sleep the whole way.